It took hours and hours more to greet the king. In the dark throne room, the only light reflected off of millions of colorful crystals glittering all about, stashed on tabletops, hanging from walls, chiseled into his throne. I kept my hands behind my back, body lowered somewhat, just waiting for the boring part to be over. Bellin had a clawed hand twisted in my shirt, while Lionie's foot was planted in front of mine. They barricaded me, their heads nearly bent down to their knees. "You have returned victorious," King Richard the somethingeth droned. "My lions, my pride, my joy. Oh, how Polny has missed you. My commander, my vice-commander, my friends, Garf, Chod, my brethren, my classmates, my childhood friends." I couldn't help my harsh sigh, much to Bellin's ire. The loud one gasped, sucking in every last bit of breath I just let out, as if it was illegal to pollute the sovereign's air with our presence. I almost snorted. Brats from the streets and brats from the ivory palaces were both the same. They took this shit far too seriously. If the king was such good friends with boss or nanny, then did that mean he'd trained in the mud with the rest of us for years upon years? Hardly. Rory was nowhere to be seen. Why hadn't he woken me up? Told me he was going on ahead. Where was he now? Why wasn't he here? "I do admire your tenacity as my pride of lions, but, friend, perhaps you could explain how it came to be that you cut off that insidious villain's head before receiving royal permission?" I rolled my eyes heavenward. Friends, as if, who would ever question the boss like that? Did he not know who he was speaking to? Bellin shoved my chin flat to my chest, and now Lionie's hand also balled into my shirt. "I assessed that there was no time to inform your majesty," Commander Garfield answered, never hesitating. His voice rang loud, clear, far more dignified than the overgrown serpent coiled about the throne. "I felt that if we did not strike while the iron was hot, then we would lose out on the only chance we had of putting an end to it." There was silence as the various commanders of the other regiments all stared at the unflinching lion. Their squirrely gazes were nothing compared to the boss. He had them all beat, neatly trimmed beard, steady eyes, a uniform filled to maximum intimidation. His lion's pelt could only drape across one shoulder from how large he had grown throughout the decades of his service. Even so, the pelt remained in impeccable order. No lizard, or wolf, or dragon, or hawk could begin to compare. Definitely no deer or beaver. So why were we still talking about this? I needed to go find Rory. "I see," King Rich said, raising one bejeweled hand. Everyone bowed low, nearly to the floor. I dipped my head a little more. "The war is won. Your judgment is sound. I trust you, Garf. Of course I trust you. My lions, my pride, my joy. Your daughters have missed you both. Now that the war is won, may the pride retreat back to their home. May all my glorious soldiers celebrate this victory for days to come. Let us feast." Flattening his hand with a booming flourish, a grand salute echoed through every soldier, elite and common, cramped in the throne room. "Crystallize, crystallize, crystallize." We were seated at the king's table. On one side were the lions, and on the other, the dragons of the skies. Somewhere to my left, seated next to the king, I could vaguely hear the commander's low, rumbling voice matched with the vice commander's equally low, rumbling voice. At the sovereign's other side, the commander of the dragons sat in silence. a stick-thin, specter-looking thing, who also happened to be the princess. I hadn't been given a chance to sneak away, but at least I was no longer stuck between these two. I glanced to my right, where Bellin and Lione occupied themselves by fighting over a chunk of meat. The seat on my left had opened suddenly, after the lieutenant previously sitting there had been called away for some reason or other. His wife just went into labor. Bellin poked a fork into my face, nearly taking out Lione's eye in the process. So stop sulking. Once you get married and start a family, then it'll be appropriate, sometimes, to leave before the king has had his fill. And what was that earlier? You can't look at the sovereign in the eye. What were you thinking, you dunce? I poked at my mutton and seafood ensemble distastefully, settling on a roll that I dipped into the shrimp butter. I wasn't looking at him. I was looking behind him. I'd seen a flash of white and wondered if it could be the snowy shade of a white lion. Unbelievable, Bellin snorted, turning away to guzzle a cup and a half's worth of mead. Lione winced on their behalf, but I just raised a brow. Why were they celebrating like they didn't have the most sensitive stomach among us? They couldn't even eat bugs when we ran out of rations. Said they were too crunchy, as if that mattered when the alternative was starving. A body plopped into the seat beside me, but I could tell immediately from their smell that it wasn't Rory. The newcomer grinned sheepishly. My eyes landed on the crest of the dragonlings, holding his scaly cape together at his collar. "Sorry," he said with a squeaky voice. "Is it okay if I sit here? My senior brothers took my seat, but I wasn't finished eating yet." I eyed his plate, separated into neat portions. It looked as if it had barely been nibbled on. Whatever. I turned away. "I'm kicking you out once Rory gets here." "Thank you, sir." The pipsqueak gave a dramatic dip of his head, causing choked laughter and immediate coughing to resound on my right. I ignored them all, as my eyes stayed fixed on the doorway, where attendants buzzed in and out, chef hats and server ties and servant cloaks entering, all rotating around one another as they served the 100 or so people seated at the giant table. But this was less chaos than where the rest of the army celebrated. The main dining hall in the adjacent room was so loud, I was surprised Boss hadn't gone over there to bash some heads into walls. He knew he could count on me for that, right? "Excuse me, Sir L. Is it real that your cubs are thrown into a den of lions when you begin training?" the pipsqueak asked, through a mouthful, corn showering his chin. "Yes," I replied, as Lione hastened with, "No!" The loud one gaped at me, but I didn't know what his problem was. It was Bellin who cut in. "We're the lions. No child gets thrown into a den of beasts." "Not right away," I added, and the two of them continued to glare at me. "Wow," the pipsqueak gushed, showering my bare arm with more corn. He munched happily, taking way too long to swallow one tiny mouthful. The kid's chewing was already getting on my nerves. "So you do fight lions?" "In initiation," I answered. "You hunt a predator, win, and become a predator." Wow, his eyes mooned wide. "But then, why don't you wear your pelt, sir?" More coughing and choked laughter at the respectful address. "Everyone else has one but you." At a flash of white, I half stood from my seat, only to freeze awkwardly as I realized it was just a servant that was wearing white and carrying a mug of mead to the table. I met Nanny's eyes, lined with kindness and concern. Before he could ask me if I was all right and make this a spectacle, I sat back down, swigging my own cup of mead almost entirely, before registering the loud one speaking at a volume that caused several dragons across the table to wrinkle their faces in displeasure, glaring at him with slitted eyes. "This guy didn't kill his," he narrated for the entire world to hear. "He could only find an abandoned infant out in the scrub. Instead of killing it, he nursed it back to health. It still follows him around to this day. His big little stalker." The pipsqueak's eyes were round. Didn't he fail then? Nah. Liony put an arm around my shoulder, and I did him the kindness of not hacking it off with a steak knife. It was just a formality. It's an old practice. But this kid here's the best we got, yeah? How could we fail him for not killing a cub? Rory's the same, I swear, cut from the same cloth. I'd almost think they were brothers for real, if they didn't look so different. They didn't kill their lion either? I was bored. Without Rory around, the food didn't even taste right. I wanted to get up. I wanted to run. I wanted to tear down this palace and rifle through every crystal and muddy brick. Where was he? Nah, Rory found a pregnant lioness. A white one, if you'll believe it. As Liony gushed about things that had nothing to do with him, dancers whose hands were loaded with dessert platters began filtering into the hall. Dressed in beads, golden cloth, and glittering with jewels, immediate whistles resounded through the hall. My lip curled in distaste. We were always surrounded by skin at war and at camp. What was the big deal now? So he helped her give birth, stayed by her side while she died, and even hung around until the pride found them and took the cubs. They never attacked him. Amazing, right? It appeared the pipsqueak's eyes would pop out of his head at any second. I scooted my chair away a tiny inch, not wanting them to fall off onto me, when a plate of caramelized nuts and honey-soaked pears appeared at my cheek, cutting right through the space between me and the dragonling. The arm was fair, nearly luminous under the crystal chandeliers. I thought I caught a whiff of something familiar, but it wasn't until I leaned to get out of the dancer's way and caught the twinkle in their eyes that I knew. Veiled hair and mouth, sure, but I knew those eyes. That scent, that stomach. The dancer winked, spinning away, light blue scarf blowing breezily in his wake.